And that's what we mean by a core belief, which is like a horrible thing to have to think about. And I want to be clear that core beliefs are not necessarily what you actually believe about yourself, but core beliefs are your biggest fear.
So this is something that we have to understand. When we look at mental illness, we assume that mental illness is something in the mind that is not working the way that it's supposed to. It's a pathology. That's because in psychiatry, we have no objective evidence of the mind.
If you feel comfortable enough, I want you to share one of your core beliefs or something that you believe is a core belief. Because we all have them, like Dr. Judy said, we all have them, but they're living down there unnoticed, and they're affecting every part of our life.
Yep.
And through CBT therapy, we can uncover something that's deep, deep, deep within us and bring light on it,
Right.
and bring awareness to it. And just that awareness changes everything.
You, however, have some combination of luck or the way that you interact with people, which you kind of said like you struggled with this. So I see that this is like, it's like a difficulty with mentalizing is what we call it.
I don't know what mentalizing means.
Mentalizing is the ability to understand other people's thought processes and internal experience, where we calculate our way to understanding other human beings instead of like understanding their subjective experience. It's cognitive empathy versus emotional empathy.
Mental health is a soft science. The categories that we outline for different diagnoses shift and change every 10 to 13 years. And the fact that the science itself is shifting and changing means that, of course, these things are somewhat ambiguous.
Like right now, we want a motherfucker that can just ambient out, sit in a classroom, absorb a fuck ton of information, chill the fuck out, not be too physically active, and then have high IQ, really good manipulation with stats figures, abstract thought or whatever, and then go and apply this in ways that make you productive in the labor economy. That's kind of the brain that we value right now in society. And it's sad because I think there are other types of brains that probably naturally exist in society, but that naturally exist in humanity, but because society selects for or desires a certain type of brain, we're trying to medicate everybody to that. We're trying to medicate everybody to that socially acceptable brain,
In general, with psychiatry anyway, we've been moving in the direction of the disorders being not a chemical imbalance. I know that's been a lot of talk lately. That's actually not a new concept, that it's not a chemical imbalance. But nonetheless, as we have moved from it's not a chemical imbalance, it's really, the disorders are really related to the connectivity between the nerves in the brain, also called neuroplasticity.
They're the ones who have more confidence, who have energy, who have motivation. Those traits are essential to human survival. We need those people.
If we have a hard time reading faces, we're going to have a hard time understanding other people's intentions. We're going to be apt to misperceive those intentions.
Right. So I agree with kind of the way that you characterize mental illness, is that it broadly is mostly a statistical norm. Things are bad enough that now we call it a diagnosis, but people can be suffering all along the spectrum and have certain symptoms along the spectrum that aren't necessarily you have borderline, correct? You can be a little bit overly attached and emotionally volatile, but not necessarily be borderline.
Yeah.
So if you look at what shows up in schizophrenia, with many cases, the what we call thought disorders, what we call the individual speech symptoms of schizophrenia.
We don't know what anyone thinks. The very idea that people have a disorder of thought is part of the psychiatric semantic trickery.
Finnegan's Wake is loaded with them, and it's just full of them. We talk about clang associations in schizophrenia, where the word that is said echoes in some way the previous word, and we call that a clang association because there's no other reason than the similarity of the sound, like a clang of a garage door being hit, and it has and sometimes it's not even a word, and we call that a neologism, a new word being created, and of course Finnegan's Wake is full of that. And then we also, in schizophrenia, there's what we call loose associations or tangential thought processes, of course, full of that, where things just go off in directions that are not linear or logical. And you can't read Finnegan's Wake, I think, without, certainly as a psychiatrist, you can't read it without thinking about schizophrenia.
It's an epidemic. of psychiatry that we are dealing with. We don't have an epidemic of mental illness, we have an epidemic of psychiatry.
We very much think that we're like these drivers of our brain and like we're the ones steering the ship. And then when somebody says like, hey, just so you know, like you might not be driving the ship today. It might actually be like anxiety driving the ship. It feels like you've just told me that I'm not a valid person, right? I think like for a lot of people, like the emotional landscape becomes like reality. And I think for women, we are more likely to fall into that pattern of viewing our emotional landscape as reality, because I think like socially we're taught that it's more okay for women because like emotions are more okay for women.
A lot of people who are neurodivergent tend to really struggle in kind of what I would argue is the very neurotypical structures that we've arisen, particularly with like academics and schooling.
So we measure like how decent a human being is, how generative they are, how much they accomplish in life, entirely based on their career.
We judge people when we meet them on the basis of success, whether we mean to or not.
The problem is that we don't critically think about ourselves.
Yeah.
There's an association between schizophrenia and what we call schizotypal personality disorder, where people are not quite in this severe state of schizophrenia, but have some magical thinking, have some unusual thought patterns. Very often, those are family members of people with schizophrenia.
We have a shortage. The shortage isn't being made up by socialists. The shortage is we have class sizes that are getting to 40 or 50 students per teacher, and we know empirically that this negatively affects their education.
So there's no brain scan that we can do to say whether you have ADHD or don't have ADHD.
The other thing that we know, and this is, really kind of what the book is about, is that if we expose ourselves chronically to substances or behaviors that repeatedly release large amounts of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, that we can change our tonic baseline and actually lower it over time as our brain tries to compensate for all of that dopamine, which is more really than we were designed to experience.
And besides telling you things you shouldn't say, religion's going to suggest to you some things you ought to be saying. Here's something you ought to say first thing when you wake up in the morning. Here's something you ought to say just before you go to sleep at night. Here's something we always say on the third Wednesday in April after the first full moon in spring at 4 o'clock when the bells ring. Religion is always suggesting things you ought to be saying.